I think that it's critical to understand how well or how poorly something is working. So you have to diagnose before you can prescribe. And it's a really important aspect of the journey is to understand what is working so you don't fix something that's not broken.
First of all, tell me a little bit about yourself. How did you get into sales? Talk to me about your helicopter background. What's going on?
Yeah, there's definitely no connection between flying helicopters and software. That is for sure. But I was fortunate enough to be able to get into aviation flight school early on. Right as I came out of college, was selected, went off and finished flight school. Went off to fly the Chinook helicopters, which is the giant tandem rotor helicopter over my right shoulder. And I was honored to serve. I really have a lot of passion for our country and for the mission of the military, and so I was honored to do it. And I was stationed at the 101st Airborne Division, which is a very notorious, very long history of accomplishments and pride. So I'm really happy to hang that as part of my resume. But as I decided to exit the military and pursue a civilian path, I went to work here in Dallas, Texas, for Texas Instruments, and did that for 7 years. And towards the end of that tenure, I actually was in a marketing role, and the product that I was responsible for was custom analog and mixed signal products. And I learned that the sales team didn't really understand that product line as well as the marketing people. And I was actually selling, but I was in a marketing role, and realized I actually thoroughly enjoyed getting out in front of customers and having conversations and engaging with them in terms of how to help them solve their problems, and in fact help them solve their customers' problems. And that was the beginning of my move into sales. And when I left Texas Instruments, I went to work for a company called Mentor Graphics, which is electronic design automation. That's electrical engineering software used to design printed circuit boards, integrated circuits, system levels, all the way up to helicopters and airplanes. And I spent 22 years at Mentor Graphics in a variety of sales leadership roles. And when I left, I had responsibility. I was leading the aerospace and defense segment. So at that point, I decided I wanted to try a different vector in software. What did I want to do differently besides design automation? And I moved into the SaaS space, and worked at a social media company for several years. They were acquired, and then decided to join Upland Software, which is an incredibly great company to work for. The leadership is phenomenal, and I've been here for 13 months now, and really enjoying the role and the product business unit that I'm focused on.
Such a great answer. I always love it when there's a great story behind someone's journey. So it's so cool to hear you talk about your experiences and your life in such an optimistic, and sometimes the way that I refer to people is like you've got the sunshine way of explaining your life, and that's what you've got, and that's such a great way to be. So that's really cool. How did you find the transition going from aviation into something like SaaS? What was it like? What was the shift like throughout the years?
Yeah, that's a great question. It was a challenge, but I love challenges. I try to challenge myself to learn something new every single day. I feel that that's part of my requirement is I have to go to bed knowing that I learned something. And moving from the army and the mentality of the military to a civilian sector was a challenge in and of itself, because you have to lead by influence, not necessarily by authority. Sure, you have positional authority, but we're all equals. We're all pulling on the rope in the same direction. And so your ability to explain why you need something done versus doing it because I said so was not as big of a challenge as I thought it would be, because when I was in the military, I was part of teams that we worked together regardless of rank. And but the biggest challenge was learning the industry, which was so very different from anything I had ever done while I was in the military. But I also found that when my feet hit the ground every morning, it was extremely exciting, because I knew I was going to learn, and I was going to force myself out of my comfort zone. And I think that's a differentiator, is enjoying the discomfort, because you don't know what you don't know, and being vulnerable enough to say, I'm not sure, let me go find out.
That's a great answer. I think that it takes a lot of bravery to have that sort of attitude to things, which I suppose is something that you gathered from the military, and having that bravery to say, do you know what? I don't know what I'm doing. I don't know what tomorrow is going to bring, but I'm going to do it anyway because I need to learn. That's a great answer from you. You were saying earlier that you walked into sales and you realize that reps sometimes don't really know what they're doing and don't really know how to do this and that. So I guess my first question is, if we get into adoption of new processes and adopting new tactics, what would you say is the groundwork required to guarantee a successful adoption of a new process, and perhaps a new leadership or anything like that?
Well, that is a very multi-layered question. So I will do my best here, but I think the first the first aspect of it is to help explain the why behind the what, because there are very few companies that have zero processes in place. There's something in place, whether it's an Excel spreadsheet or some form of a CRM. Somebody's doing something to track their business, and I think that it's critical to understand how well or how poorly something is working. So you have to diagnose before you can prescribe. And it's a really important aspect of the journey, is to understand what is working so you don't fix something that's not broken. But in all likelihood, you're there because you need to make some process improvements. And so part of the fundamentals is explaining to those who are going to implement it the why behind the what. Here's the reason we have to go make this change. And then once you have explained that and allow the process to be vetted through the team, and listen to objections and try to understand, is the objection based off of a systemic concern, or is it based off of an internal concern of a fear of the unknown, right? They don't know what they're going to have to do. And I think once you cross that bridge, then you're in the position of execution. And the process and the steps of executing have to be very well defined and laid out so that you are following a playbook. I'm extremely process oriented. I don't do well flying by the seat of my pants. And so I think that goes back to flying helicopters, where you have to have a process. If something goes wrong when you're in the cockpit, you have to know what the process is to safely get the aircraft to the ground. And I think that process mentality has transferred very nicely into the civilian sector, in terms of, how do I implement a process? How do I implement a scalable, repeatable method for us to be successful?
Understood. So you were saying about having that process. So what would you say, what part does tech and data capture have in this process? So where does it lay within process adoption, or just anything like that?
Right. I think there's a critical importance of the data and automation, and then the process itself, because once you get the process installed and it's accurate and it's repeatable, that is a piece that you can check the block and say, I've got this. Now I need to do is execute. I think that when you have people who are running a process that is not scalable, it's not repeatable, it induces variability into the process, and therefore the results. It makes it less likely that you can have a credible and successful forecast methodology, for example. And that's a big piece of why you would put a forecasting process in place, is obviously to find the pathway to exceed quota, not just meet quota. That's table stakes, right? There's an expectation that your sales team will meet their quota. That just gets you in the game. So the stretch is, how do we blow the number away? And when you have a process in place that is scalable and repeatable, and everyone is executing to that process, then you increase the likelihood and credibility that you're going to do exactly what you say you do.
Understood. That's very interesting. I completely agree with you that you need to have that groundwork to keep it going. And another thing that I was going to ask you is, say you've got a champion within your sales team, where are they involved in this new process adoption? Do they help you out in any way? What does that look like?
I think that there's so much to be gained by utilizing your subject matter experts and those who are completely on board with that process change or a process modification, because in all likelihood those folks have been on board. They're probably respected within the team. They're looked at as the core knowledge base to go to, and if you show success with them, the others will likely come along much quicker. They're a source of informal verification. It's not always the right thing or the comfortable thing to call up the leader and ask questions. But if you can go to somebody who's in a peer group and say, hey, how did this work for you? I'm struggling with this piece. How did you cross this bridge? There's that informal alliance where that subject matter expert, that person who is really good, your strongest person perhaps, is able to advocate on your behalf, advocate for the process, and it probably accelerates the adoption.
Understood. The way that I usually look at things is when people trust people, right? So when you've got someone that completely understands something, it's a lot easier to implement it further. So I guess my other question to you is, do you think that new process adoption is subjective to the relationship that you've got with your champions and your team?
I think to an extent, but there's also a balance between having buy-in from everybody and saying, okay, I understand you're uncomfortable. I understand you may not like or want to do this, but this is the direction we're going, and we need everyone to get on board. This is a voluntary organization. If this isn't for you, I get it. I wish you all the best of luck, but this is the direction we're going. So there's probably a tipping point where resistance becomes counterproductive versus seeking to understand. And I think when you hit that tipping point, it's best to work with those individuals to say, perhaps this isn't the right organization or the right role. Let's see what else we can explore for options.
Yeah, that's a great point that you've brought up there, is that sometimes you do need to put your foot down and be like, look, whether you like it or not, this is what's happening. So tough.
I do try to speak with my team, in the past, and I'm speaking not just of my current team, but of all the sales teams, to say we can have one-on-one discussions. I'm very open to challenges and questions of why and how, and maybe there's a better solution. There's nothing that says this is absolutely the best way to go, but understand that there are certain times when a decision has to be made as an organization, and we have to take this path. And you're welcome to disagree, but I think that if, as an organization, we've made that decision as a company, then you have a choice to make of your own. And when we walk out the door, we're either locked arm in arm, shoulder to shoulder to go forth and execute, or you decide this isn't where I want to be. And that's okay. I mean, sometimes process changes aren't right for everybody. So there are people who love being in a very small company, 10, 20 people, and that's their forte. But it gets acquired and all of a sudden they're part of a 200 person company or 500 person company, and it's just not their comfort zone. So it's different strokes for different folks, and that's totally okay.
Yeah, completely understood. And that's the way that I see it as well. I think it's really important to respect it from both sides of the coin. Another thing that I was going to ask you is, I think that piece of advice is actually really valuable. Another thing that I was going to ask you is, what would you say is a really important tip for like a successful process adoption that might not be so obvious to others?
Wow, that's a tough one. I think there's no singular piece of information or tip. That I think it's about the entire process. It's change management. It's explaining to everyone what the desired end result is. There are so many people who are really, really good when they're told the boundary conditions and what the desired end state is, and then allowed to kind of freely move in that space to get the job done. And I think that when you provide those boundary conditions and where we want to get to, and then talk about things that facilitate the process, people really get on board much, much faster.
Yeah, totally agree. A bit more of a, I guess, maybe not a personal question, but a little bit deeper there. What would you say has been the worst rollout of like process rollout that you've ever had, and why?
Oh gosh, can I only give one? My career, I've had rollouts that did not go as expected, but I do try to look at everything as a learning experience. Sometimes the worst leaders that you ever had turn out to be the best leaders that you can learn from how not to be, as an example. And I think that from a process perspective, there was a process rollout that was more of a mandate. There was no information behind it. It was just, hey, here it is, start using it. You have a week to get everything up and running. And there were so many questions, and it was obvious that they had not thought through all the permutations and combinations of what could go wrong to trying to get to that end state, and everything that could go wrong did go wrong. And we ended up working through an Excel spreadsheet just to try to keep some sanity of what our forecast looked like. So when things can go wrong, they can go very wrong if you don't have the process in place and the transition management plan in place.
Great. Great. That's good to know. I think it's really important for a lot of folks, especially when they're just starting out, to know about the mistakes that other leaders have made throughout the year, so that they know that, okay, we can't rush a new process. It needs to take time. You need to be patient with it so that others can be patient with you. So it's a great question and great answer there as well.
And Andy, that also ties back to the sales process, because as salespeople, when you are selling software, it's very rare that a company is out there seeking a solution because they have no software in place. They typically have something in place. And so it's really important for salespeople to understand the timeline, not just to buy the product, but the transition to implement, because you are typically doing some type of a rip and replace, and there is the potential for a pocket veto. Somebody loves that solution because they advocated for it, but someone else is coming in to change it. So you really have to be thorough in your discovery and your due diligence about what the implementation timeline looks like, so you don't miss set expectations with the customer, with your leadership, with the sales team, so that it's understood what that timeline looks like.
Great advice. Very, very great advice. It goes so much deeper than just adopting a new process, doesn't it? It's so much deeper than that. And I think a lot of young people that first come into this area, coming into sales, coming into revenue, coming into operations, like implementing something seems like you could snap your fingers and it'd be done, but in reality it's so much more difficult, isn't it?
It is. And I think there's the art of communication that has to be continuously improved. And I think that as we enter into the post-pandemic space and people leave the one-dimensional video conferencing world and get back to interpersonal communications, it's no longer going to be acceptable to kind of glance to the other screen. You're going to be one-on-one with people. And I think it's really important that the art of communication is practiced and people understood that you have to be aware of your communication skills, whether it's on the phone, the words you use, your body posture, everything, post-pandemic, where people are sitting around in their sweatpants and, they've got a polo shirt on. But I think all of that changes soon when we get back to the reality of post-pandemic sales and marketing opportunities.
Yeah, I think, especially coming back to reality, everything's gonna be very, very different. I guess you mentioned communication there, and in thinking about communication, I think forecasting is definitely a way of communicating, and a way that a lot of us have communicated throughout the pandemic and beyond. And we did say that we wanted to have a chat about forecasting. So let's dive a little bit deeper into that. Who would you say does the responsibility of forecasting fall on?
I would say that it's the foundation is the AE, the account executive. The forecasting starts with that person, because the accuracy and the credibility of the opportunity is foundational to everything that gets rolled up and reported up all the way up through the president and CEO, and ultimately to the street if it's a publicly traded company. So their ability to understand the process, the stages for reporting, what the criteria are to be in the stages, the movement as you progress through the pipeline, all of that begins with the account executive. And then as you traverse the organization, there's more and more judgment that gets applied based off of the established credibility of the AE and their relationship with their customer or their potential customer.
Yeah, agreed. Do you think it goes beyond AEs as well? So how does that look like for you? So from AE and then rolls up? Is that what the process is for you?
Yeah, I'd say it's more of a spider web. There's not a clean decision matrix when it comes to the credibility and the accuracy of forecasting and the communication, because you have solutions engineers who have, established credibility with the customer as the technical expert, and to actually maybe obtain a little more information about where the customer is going in their journey and understanding what it is we need to get to, versus a salesperson who sometimes may have happy ears and hear what they think is, yeah, this deal is going to happen. And what the customer said was, I think the solution could fit my needs,
Yeah.
right? That doesn't mean they're going to buy it because there's a lot of steps left in that process. But the solutions engineer tends to look at things and it's a different angle. It's an oblique angle of listening and gathering that information. And when you bring those together in an account meeting or account review or account planning session, you get different ideas, different perspectives of what was heard in the meetings. And that's why I think it's critically important for everyone to play back what they heard and where they think we're going and come to an agreement on that versus a singular perspective. I think a single thread or single point of contact is a recipe for a single point of failure.
Understood. So saying that that could be a single point of failure, what would you say, have you built any sort of process that has been instrumental for great forecasting and successful forecasting?
I think I've seen it just work incredibly well. And then I've seen it fall apart just because the definitions weren't crisp and clear. And I think that if you define each stage, early stage, upside, and commit in this example, if you define what those are and it's well understood and it's been relayed to the sales teams and they've had a chance to question it and maybe you broaden it a little bit or skinny it down. I think that if you have that foundation of definitions, it's almost like when you're entering into a contract with a customer, you start with the definitions. So everybody's on the same page. It's the same thing with the forecast. You start with the definitions. And once we are all agreed on the definitions, there is that opportunity to stray where people want to enter into some judgment or something that varies from that. But you rein them back in and say, no, that doesn't meet the definition of upside. That's more early stage. And the understanding that when you commit, there's a credibility issue. And that credibility issue comes with consequences. If something is in a committed stage, you have to ensure with certainty that that deal is going to close. And if something happens, and it does, let's be real, that the committed deals, something happens, somebody has an emergency, they don't get the signature, whatever, but you have a backup plan. You have something to backfill those dollars that may fall out of the commit for whatever reason. But the rule and not the exception is when you move it to a committed stage, it is a deal that the executives could put in the books as this is coming in. And the criteria and the definitions behind that are very, very clear.
Yeah, agreed. So how would you, if you were to define successful forecasting or success in forecasting, what would be, say, 3 words that you'd use?
Verifiability. Mm-hmm. So making sure that what you hear is what you heard. Mm-hmm. And do that through playing something back to the customer. Hey, this is a summary of our call. This is what I heard. This is where we're going and next steps. Do you agree? There's a lot to be said for getting the customer's buy-in to your process. There's nothing secret about it. I think it actually opens up the door for communication. So when you have a verifiable message within the forecast, and I think that when the account executive is performing their discovery, so that would be my second word, is the discovery piece of this, is do you have a need? Do you have the authority or you have the right person in the room? And do you have an understood timeline for next steps? If you have those, I think that also solidifies what's going into the forecast. And then execution. You have to have a close plan. You have to know how to get the opportunity across the finish line where you close the deal. I think those 3 legs of a stool, any one of those 3 fails and the stool falls over.
Understood. So if we speak about the journey that you've been on through like your entire career with forecasting, what have been your best takeaways from your journey so far, and what would you do differently if you could go back?
Oh man, what I could do differently is I could take up another hour with things that I would do learnings, but I think that some of the best learnings that I've had is watching individuals come together as a team. And some of my teams, where when I took them over as a leader, they were individuals. There was multiple islands of salespeople, and the journey to bring them together as a sales team where they could learn from each other. There's this collective knowledge, this collective brain trust that is invaluable when you're working with a sales team and bringing people together. And it goes back to the art of communication. where one sales team is explaining their successes and more importantly, their failures on what worked and what did not work, so that the other teams that are in the call learn and realize, okay, I was headed down that path. I can't do that. Or they have offline conversations. This camaraderie, this teamwork becomes this mechanism of sales success that's intangible. And when I see that happen with teams that I've been fortunate to be a part of in the past, we crush the number. It's the collective success that makes everyone hungry for more.
Camaraderie is such an important word when it comes to forecasting and revenue, isn't it? I think that's one of the main things that I've picked up throughout my career, is that camaraderie can really take you from here to beyond, skies and beyond. So completely agree.
It's competitive and it's accountability,
Yeah,
because you don't want to get on a group forecast call and have bad credibility because your numbers aren't what you said they were, or not be prepared for the call, or have bad hygiene in your forecasting mechanism. So there's a lot of peer pressure that comes from that. And then there's a lot of benefits and rewards when you're successful as well.
completely agree. That was a great chat about forecasting. And I guess to wrap things up, I wanted to ask you for 3 top tips / advice / best practices that you would give to someone just coming into sales. And what would you say to yourself if you were just coming into sales now?
I think, wow, I think salespeople have this incredible opportunity when they're either new to the world of sales or new to a company. You have these receptors that are turned wide open to take input and to learn. And my advice would be to use that to the fullest extent possible. Play the new person card as long as you can, because you have so many people that want you to be successful, whether it's engineering or marketing or executive leadership, that can look at that and say, this person wants to learn. They're so interested in understanding everything they can, and be that sponge, just soak it all up. Because when that time frame passes, you're now expected to know, and you're now have certain expectations for success, because that's why you were brought on. And the companies invest a tremendous amount of money to onboard you and get you to the point where you can go forth and represent them in the public eye. And so I think that that's really a really important aspect of being a new person into sales. I would also say read books. There's so many different books, and some of them are really easy reads. Some of my go-to books, like I'm a huge Patrick Lencioni fan. I love getting to yes and getting past no. There's a book called Blink that I found to be extremely well written and easy to read. And it's, once you get into the aspects of the book, you kind of get the mentality of what the messaging is. So, I would encourage people new to sales to sit down and grab a book or download a book, or ask your colleagues, hey, what do you read? What do you like to read? And leverage that. Maybe this sounds kind of old fashioned, but start a book club, start a book discussion. Right? Your colleagues all may want to read something and have a discussion about it. And again, it's that A, communication, and B, different angle of viewing and learning and hearing, that when you round it all out, the collective brain trust is better as a group than it is as an individual.
Definitely. What I hear you saying is like, listen, absorb like a sponge, ask as many questions as possible, and have a sense of camaraderie through learning together.
Absolutely. And if you have a leader who's willing to lean in and help you learn, you are going to skyrocket, because, one of my mantras is lead by example and follow with humility. And I'll be the first one to say, I don't know, but let's go figure it out. I love to brainstorm and come up with a better idea. There's always a better way to do things. It's not my way or your way. It's the third way, the third alternative, and how we could go make something better.